What if I told you the biggest mistake you're making in love is trying too hard to be understood by someone who only feels safe when they don't fully have you? You keep chasing consistency from someone who survives on distance. You keep proving your worth to someone who disconnects when things get real. But here's the truth. The moment you stop performing for their comfort is the moment you start reclaiming your power. Sometimes the only way to be chosen is to stop trying not to be abandoned. Most people make one critical mistake when dealing with someone who is emotionally distant. They believe that if they just explain themselves better, speak more calmly, or express their feelings in the right way, the other person will finally understand and respond with the same level of care. So they keep talking, keep clarifying, keep defending their intentions, and keep trying to remove every possible misunderstanding. But what they don't realize is that emotional distance is not always created by misunderstanding. Sometimes it is created by discomfort with closeness itself. When someone has an avoidant pattern in relationships, often explained through attachment theory, too much emotional intensity does not feel like love to them. It feels like pressure. So when you over-explain, you are not actually building connection. You are unintentionally increasing emotional demand. And the more emotional demand they feel, the more they retreat into silence, detachment, or minimal responses. This creates a cycle where you speak more to be understood, and they distance themselves more to feel safe. The painful truth is that over-explaining slowly turns into over-chasing. You start trying to prove your intentions instead of simply living them. You explain why you texted late. You explain why you felt hurt. You explain why you need consistency. You explain your tone, your emotions, your boundaries, even your silence. And each time you do this, you unknowingly place your emotional stability in their hands, waiting for their validation to confirm that you are not too much or misunderstood. But emotionally unavailable dynamics do not improve through persuasion. They shift through experience. When you keep talking beyond a certain point, your words lose weight. Not because your feelings are invalid, but because your repetition starts replacing your presence. Instead of feeling your value, the other person starts hearing explanations. And explanations, when overused, can weaken attraction, respect, and emotional curiosity. There is also something deeper happening within you during this process. The more you over-explain, the more you train your mind to believe that silence equals loss and communication equals control. You begin to associate peace with reassurance from someone who is not consistently offering it. That creates emotional dependency where you feel the need to fix every gap in understanding immediately, even if the other person is not willing to meet you halfway. The shift happens when you understand this simple but powerful truth. Clarity does not require constant justification. A healthy connection does not force you to defend your basic emotions repeatedly. If someone values you, they will try to understand you without needing endless explanations. If someone is unsure about closeness, no amount of perfect wording will make them ready for it. So instead of over-explaining, you learn to pause. You say what you feel once, clearly and calmly. You allow space after that. You let your words exist without chasing them with more words. Because silence after clarity is not weakness, it is structure. It shows emotional maturity. It shows that you respect yourself enough not to beg for understanding that should be freely given. And slowly, something changes. Either the person steps forward with real effort, or they continue to stay distant. But in both cases, you win something important. You stop abandoning yourself in the process of trying not to be abandoned by someone else. Silence is one of the most misunderstood tools in emotional dynamics. Most people think silence means losing, giving up, or creating distance that will ruin the relationship. But in reality, silence is not absence. It is presence without pursuit. It is the moment you stop chasing answers from someone who is not offering clarity and you start observing reality instead of trying to negotiate it. When you are involved with someone who has avoidant tendencies, often described within attachment theory, chasing becomes a pattern very quickly. One person pulls away and the other tries to close the gap, so you text more, explain more, check in more, and emotionally invest more, hoping that your effort will trigger their return. But what actually happens is the opposite. The more energy you push forward, the more they feel the need to step back. Not because they don't care at all, but because emotional closeness feels overwhelming when it comes in the form of pursuit instead of mutual choice. Silence breaks this cycle. When you stop chasing, you interrupt the pattern that keeps you emotionally exhausted. You remove yourself from the role of the pursuer. And for the first time, the dynamic becomes unbalanced in a different way. Not through desperation, but through absence of reaction. This absence creates something powerful, uncertainty. And uncertainty is something avoidant individuals cannot ignore forever because they are used to distance being controlled, not surrendered. But silence is not about punishment. It is not about playing games or trying to manipulate a response. It is about returning your attention back to yourself. When you constantly chase, your emotional world revolves around their behavior. When they reply, how they reply, why they didn't reply. Silence shifts that focus. You stop measuring your worth through response time. You stop decoding every small signal. You stop living in a state of emotional alertness. At first, silence feels uncomfortable. It feels like loss. Your mind tells you that if you don't reach out, everything will fall apart. This is where most people relapse into chasing again. But if you stay in silence long enough, something begins to settle. You start noticing that your nervous system calms down. Your thoughts become clearer. You stop reacting emotionally to every delay or inconsistency. You begin to detach not from love, but from dependence. In dynamics shaped by attachment theory, silence also communicates something words cannot. It communicates self-respect. It signals that your attention is not freely available to confusion. And ironically, this is often what creates the first real pause in avoidant behavior. Not pressure, not pleading, not emotional intensity, but the absence of access to someone who was previously always available. However, the real purpose of silence is not to make someone come back. That is a secondary outcome, not the goal. The true purpose is to reveal truth. Because when you stop chasing, people show you who they are without interruption. If they care, they will reach out with clarity. If they don't, their absence becomes consistent, not confusing. Silence removes fantasy and replaces it with reality. There is also a deeper shift happening inside you. Silence forces you to sit with your own emotions instead of outsourcing them. You begin to learn that discomfort is not danger. You learn that not receiving immediate reassurance does not mean abandonment. This is emotional independence forming in real time. And once you experience that, you stop fearing silence. You start respecting it. Eventually, you realize that silence is not something you use to get someone back. It is something you use to get yourself back. Being comfortable with disappointment is one of the most emotionally powerful skills a person can develop, especially in relationships where connection feels inconsistent, unpredictable, or one-sided. Most people spend their emotional energy trying to avoid disappointment at all costs. They want clarity, reassurance, consistent replies, and stable affection. But when they don't receive it, instead of accepting the reality, they begin adjusting themselves, lowering their standards, and overinvesting emotionally in hopes of changing the outcome. In dynamics influenced by attention theory, this fear of disappointment becomes even stronger. When someone is emotionally inconsistent, your nervous system starts to stay on alert. You begin to anticipate their withdrawal, their silence, or their sudden distance. And because you are trying so hard not to feel the pain of being let down, you unconsciously start tolerating patterns that repeatedly hurt you. You forgive inconsistency faster than you should. You accept mixed signals longer than you should. You explain away behavior that clearly does not align with emotional safety. But emotional growth begins when you stop treating disappointment as something dangerous. Disappointment is not a threat. It is information. It tells you where effort is, not mutual. It shows you where emotional investment is, not balanced. It reveals whether hormone is genuinely available or only partially present in your life. The moment you stop avoiding this truth, you start seeing people as they are, not as you hope they could be. Learning to be okay with disappointment does not mean you become cold or detached. It means you stop bargaining with reality. Instead of asking, how can I make them treat me better? You begin asking, what is this situation already showing me? This shift is subtle, but life-changing. Because when you stop trying to protect yourself from disappointment, you also stop building fantasies that keep you emotionally stuck. One of the hardest parts of this process is realizing that some people will not meet you at the level of consistency you desire. They may show care in moments, but withdraw when things become emotionally real. They may be warm one day and distant the next. And instead of interpreting this as something you need to fix, you begin accepting it as something you need to observe. That acceptance is not defeat, it is clarity. When you are deeply attached, especially in emotionally inconsistent relationships, disappointment often feels like failure. You feel like you did something wrong, or that if you had acted differently, the outcome would have changed. But in reality, many emotional patterns are not caused by your behavior. They are shaped by the other person's internal comfort with intimacy, vulnerability, and closeness. No amount of perfect communication can force someone to feel safe with connection if they are not ready for it. Being comfortable with disappointment means you stop personalizing other people's limitations. You stop turning their inconsistency into your responsibility. Instead, you allow reality to unfold without resistance. If someone pulls away, you observe it. If someone does not match your effort, you notice it. If someone confuses you repeatedly, you bail. Leave the confusion instead of trying to solve it endlessly. This acceptance creates emotional strength because now your pace is no longer dependent on constant reassurance. You stop needing every interaction to end in clarity. You stop needing every conversation to fix uncertainty. You allow space for outcomes you do not control, and in doing so, you reclaim control over your internal state. At first, this feels uncomfortable because your mind is used to chasing certainty. But over time, something powerful happens. Your tolerance for emotional instability decreases. You no longer stay in situations just because you hope they might improve. You start valuing consistency over potential. You begin choosing peace over confusion. And most importantly, you stop abandoning yourself in the process of trying not to be disappointed by someone else. Setting boundaries without guilt is one of the most transformative emotional skills you can develop, especially in relationships where inconsistency, emotional distance, or mixed signals are present. Many people understand boundaries logically, but emotionally, they struggle to enforce them because guilt immediately follows any attempt to protect their own needs. They feel like they are being too strict, too demanding, or too difficult for simply asking for basic respect, clarity, or consistency. In relationships influenced by patterns explained in attachment theory, guilt becomes even more intense because emotionally distant dynamics often normalize imbalance. When someone is inconsistent, your system slowly adapts to their unpredictability. You start lowering expectations just to maintain connection. So when you finally try to set a boundary, it feels unnatural, not because it is wrong, but because your emotional system has been trained to tolerate less than you deserve. Boundaries are not about controlling the other person. They're about defining what you will and will not accept in your emotional space. But when guilt enters the picture, boundaries get distorted. Instead of saying, "This behavior doesn't work for me," you start saying, "Maybe I should adjust. Maybe I am asking for too much. Maybe I should be more understanding." This internal negotiation weakens your emotional position and places your needs at the bottom of the hierarchy. The truth is, guilt is often not a sign that you are doing something wrong. It is a sign that you are doing something new. If you have been conditioned to overgive, over-explain, or over-accommodate, then any act of self-respect will initially feel uncomfortable. Your mind will interpret boundaries as rejection, even when they are actually protection. That is why people often abandon their boundaries right after setting them, because the discomfort of guilt feels heavier than the discomfort of being mistreated. But real emotional strength comes from staying consistent even when guilt appears. When you set a boundary and stick to it, you are teaching your nervous system a new pattern, that your needs matter even when others are uncomfortable with them. You are also teaching others how to treat you by showing them what your emotional limits are. Without boundaries, people are not necessarily malicious. They simply operate within the limits you unconsciously allow. In avoidant dynamics, where emotional availability can be inconsistent or withdrawn, boundaries become even more essential. Without them, you risk falling into a cycle where you accept sporadic attention as connection and confusion as normal communication. You start adjusting your emotional communication downward just to maintain contact. But boundaries interrupt this pattern. They create structure where there was uncertainty. A healthy boundary is simple, calm, and clear. It does not require emotional escalation or long explanations. The more you over-explain a boundary, the more it becomes negotiable. And when boundaries become negotiable, they lose their power. The goal is not to convince the other person. The goal is to clearly define your standard and allow your actions to reflect it. Guilt will often try to pull you back into old patterns. It will say things like, "You are being unfair," or "You might lose them if you enforce this," or "Maybe you should just let it go this time." But what guilt rarely tells you is that every time you ignore a boundary, you also ignore your own emotional well-being. You slowly teach yourself that your comfort is optional. When you start practicing boundaries consistently, something important changes inside you. You begin to feel more stable emotionally. You stop overthinking every interaction. You stop tolerating confusion for the sake of connection. And most importantly, you start respecting yourself in real time, not just in thought. Over time, guilt loses its power. It doesn't disappear completely, but it stops controlling your decisions. You begin to understand that love without respect is not stability, and connection without boundaries is not safety. You realize that protecting your peace is not selfish, it is necessary. And in that realization, you stop negotiating your worth just to maintain access to someone who cannot meet you at your level of emotional clarity. Every emotionally draining dynamic has one thing in common. Mixed signals get rewarded. Someone is warm today, distant tomorrow, then suddenly affectionate again. And instead of stepping back, most people lean in harder. They start analyzing patterns, decoding messages, replaying conversations, and holding on to the good moments as proof that things are still working. But what is really happening is simple. Inconsistency is by Angie, reinforced through your continued emotional investment. And attachment-based dynamics explained by attachment theory. Intermittent reinforcement is one of the strongest psychological hooks. It works like unpredictability in reward systems. When affection or attention is given randomly, the brain becomes more fixated on earning it again. This is why mixed signals feel more addictive than clear rejection. Clear rejection gives closure. Mixed signals create hope. And hope keeps you engaged even when your emotional needs are not being met. When you reward mixed signals, you are not just reacting emotionally, you are training the other person's behavior toward you. Every time they withdraw and you chase, they learn that distance does not cost them connection. Every time they come back casually and you respond warmly without addressing the inconsistency, you teach them that emotional instability is acceptable. Over time, this creates a pattern where effort becomes optional, but access to you remains constant. What makes this even more damaging is that mixed signals create internal confusion. You stop trusting your perception. One moment, you feel important. The next, you feel ignored. One moment, you feel chosen. The next, you feel uncertain. Instead of seeing this as a clear sign of inconsistency, you start interpreting it as something you need to figure out. So you invest more energy trying to understand the behavior rather than responding to it. But emotional clarity only comes when behavior is taken at face value. If someone is consistent, you don't need to decode them. If someone is inconsistent, you don't need to chase them for answers. The pattern itself is the answer. The problem begins when you separate actions from meaning and start giving emotional weight to potential instead of reality. Stopping the reward cycle of mixed signals is not about punishment or emotional games. It is about alignment. It means your energy only matches consistency, not confusion. It means you stop treating occasional affection as proof of stability. It means you stop celebrating small moments of attention while ignoring the larger pattern of distance. At first, this shift feels uncomfortable because your emotional system is used to reacting quickly. You want to respond when they return. You want to reconnect when they show warmth. You want to keep things alive, even if nothing has actually been stable. But this reaction is exactly what maintains the cycle. Every quick response to inconsistency resets the pattern instead of breaking it. When you stop rewarding mixed signals, something interesting happens. The dynamic either stabilizes or fades. If the other person is capable of consistency, your lack of overreaction forces clarity into the relationship. They either step up or step out. If they are not capable of consistency, their inconsistency becomes more visible and less emotionally confusing to you. The most powerful part of this shift is internal. You stop living in emotional reaction mode. You stop waiting for the next message to decide how you feel. You stop adjusting your self-worth based on someone's availability. Instead, you begin to anchor your emotional state in patterns, not moments. Over time, your tolerance for inconsistency naturally decreases. You no longer find mixed signals exciting. You find them draining. You stop romanticizing potential and start respecting consistency. You stop confusing emotional highs with emotional security. And in that space, you reclaim something important, your emotional attention. Because where your attention goes repeatedly, your life follows. When you stop feeding inconsistency, you stop building your life around uncertainty. Choosing yourself first is not a selfish act. It is the foundation of emotional stability, especially in relationships where love feels uncertain, inconsistent, or conditional. Most people misunderstand self-prioritization. They think it means ignoring others, becoming cold, or shutting people out. But in reality, choosing yourself means no longer abandoning your own emotional needs in the hope of keeping someone else close. In relational patterns, often described through attachment theory, people frequently lose themselves in the effort to maintain connection. When someone is inconsistent, emotionally distant, or unpredictable, it triggers a strong internal response. If I try harder, maybe they will stay. So you begin adjusting your behavior, reducing your needs, and increasing your tolerance for discomfort. Slowly, your emotional center shifts away from yourself and becomes anchored in the other person's availability. Choosing yourself first reverses that direction. It brings your emotional focus back to your own experience, what you feel, what you need, and what you will no longer tolerate. This does not happen in one dramatic decision. It happens in small, repeated acts of self-respect. It is saying no when you want to say yes, but know it will hurt you later. It is not replying immediately when you feel emotionally triggered. It is stepping back when confusion becomes a pattern instead of an exception. One of the hardest parts of choosing yourself is realizing how much you have been conditioned to abandon your needs for the sake of connection. Many people confuse emotional intensity with emotional safety. They think if something feels strong, it must be meaningful. But intensity without consistency creates attachment, not stability. And when you are attached to inconsistency, you start normalizing emotional uncertainty as part of love. Choosing yourself means breaking that normalization. It means acknowledging that love should not constantly require emotional negotiation. You should not have to decode, chase, or overthink basic communication. You should not have to shrink your needs to keep someone comfortable. If a connection only works when you suppress your emotional truth, then it is not a balanced connection. It is emotional self-abandonment disguised as attachment. At first, self-prioritization feels uncomfortable because it disrupts familiar patterns. You may feel anxiety when you stop chasing. You may feel guilt when you set boundaries. You may feel fear when you stop overgiving. But these feelings are not signs that you are doing something wrong. They are signs that you are doing something unfamiliar. Your nervous system is adjusting to a new reality where your needs are no longer being ignored. Over time, something powerful begins to shift. You start noticing that your emotional energy is no longer constantly drained. You stop overanalyzing every interaction. You stop waiting for validation to feel secure. You begin to build an internal sense of stability that is not dependent on someone else's behavior. That is emotional independence. Choosing yourself also changes the way others treat you. When you consistently prioritize your emotional well-being, you stop being available for inconsistency. People who cannot meet you with clarity either step up or naturally step away. This is not because you are pushing them away. It is because your energy no longer accommodates confusion. The most important realization in this process is that choosing yourself is not about losing love. It is about losing self-abandonment. You are not rejecting connection. You are rejecting imbalance. You are not becoming unavailable for love. You are becoming unavailable for love. You are becoming unavailable for relationships that require you to disappear within them. And in that shift, you reclaim something that was always yours, your emotional center. You stop asking, how do I make them stay? And start asking, does this feel right for me? That question alone changes everything.